How are you? Good.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. Like I said, my name's Scotty Brown. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the pastor of Western Springs Cowboy Church. And we kind of hooked up with Doug Toomer and Stand Up for Idaho. And I've been wanting to do something with WallBuilders for years. I think I heard David probably 25 years ago, and was just very impressed with his knowledge of history, the history of our country, the faith that is connected to our founding fathers, and just a lot of stuff we don't hear about today. And so I know Stand Up for Idaho always does a pledge and a prayer, so if you'll stand with me, and we'll say the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let's pray. Father, we come tonight before you, Lord, and we're pretty convinced by all the evidences of our history, Lord, that you supernaturally founded this country and moved on the hearts of the men who were willing to, Lord, leave tyranny and establish a nation that is, Lord, really maybe only second to Israel in the world in its history because of who you are, Lord. And so we just ask that you would be with us tonight. I pray for those who have yet to come into a saving knowledge of Jesus, Lord, that they would just, with the confession of their mouth, Lord, that they would just call on you. And the Bible tells us that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So as Tim comes and gives us a presentation, Lord, give us ears to hear and hearts to receive and minds to understand. And we pray in the mighty and powerful name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. All right, you may be seated. And so I'm going to turn it over to Tim Barton now, the president of WallBuilders. And so would you welcome him?
Well, I'm so glad to be with you tonight. I'm going to be using the screen a lot, and so if you can kind of angle yourself to see the screen, it'll be helpful. I'm going to start with a quote from a book written in 1949 by George Orwell. The book was 1984. If you haven't read it, it's basically prophetic for where we are today. But in this, as we talk about the notion of history, George Orwell talked about something significant to history. He said, whoever controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And the basic premise is that whoever controls right now controls the narrative that's being told about the past. Right? The modern educators get to say, well, critical race theory, the 1619 Project, they get to say a lot of things that historically are not grounded, that are not true, but because that's who controls the present. When you look at a lot of what's happening in the educational system, this is where a problem is. Now, why does it even matter, the story about the past? One of the things he pointed out is that whoever controls the past controls the future. If you have a perspective of the past, it will impact the direction you're going in the future, right? If you think the founding fathers were all racist and evil and bigoted people, if you think America was fundamentally founded to promote and protect the institution of slavery, or there's systemic racism and every institution in America is racist, if that's your perspective of the past, it's going to impact the way we walk in the future. And this is part of that notion, which is not surprisingly, if we look at some of the Marxist ideology being promoted in culture today, if you go back to the 1960s and 70s, when there was talk about the founding fathers, a common theme was the founding fathers were sexually immoral people. They were adulterers, they were philanderers. If you get to the 80s and 90s, we hear the founding fathers really weren't religious people. They didn't really believe in God, and they were atheists and agnostics and deists, and there was a separation of church and state. When you get to the 2000s and the 2010s, then we hear, well, they were racist and they were bigoted and they were slaveholders. And it's worth just kind of asking the question, why have there been consistent attacks on the founding fathers for the last several decades? This is a Marxist ideology. Because if you can tarnish or taint the individuals who gave us the Constitution, right? If the founding fathers were evil, then what they did was evil. And when you're trying to overthrow the Constitution or overthrow America as a whole, you need to first tarnish the guys who gave us that system and that framework. And this is part of what we see. And this is where it's not surprising that if you go forward in 1980, Howard Zinn wrote a book, A People's History of the United States. Now, historians, especially modern historians, have recognized the incredible errors in what he did. But Howard Zinn took this from what's known as a deconstruction approach. And a deconstruction approach is that you're trying to tear down the status quo, tear down what exists, And so every negative thing that you can imagine about America, Howard Zinn said, that's who America is, that's what we've done. And some of the things he talked about were real things that did happen. There were really bad moments in American history, but then he lied about a whole bunch of things that didn't actually happen or were different than what he said, but his premise was he wanted to show that America is fundamentally flawed, that it's evil. Well, this was a book written in 1980. Students in public school, this was a required reading for them in public school. Those students who went through public school in the 80s, when this was required reading, they're now professors. So guess what they're now teaching? All of these evils about America that Howard Zinn largely promoted. And let me just give you one example. Howard Zinn, which if you back up, you can see it says 1492 to present. Well, 1492, let's just start where Howard Zinn started, because he says, well, Columbus was an evil, genocidal, mass-murdering, rapist maniac. That's who Columbus was. Okay? There is now a movement in America to replace Columbus Day with what is known as Indigenous Peoples Day. In fact, this year, President Biden, instead of recognizing Columbus Day, he says we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day this year in America. Now, full disclosure, I have no problem celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day. Like, fully, no problem at all. However, the idea is we're trying to cancel Columbus. So, pause, we're going to come back to that in a second. Let me go back to Indigenous Peoples Day. Okay, I have no problem saying let's celebrate Indigenous people. I would just like to ask a question. Which Indigenous people should we celebrate? This is important. Because we're acting like, see, Disney did the movie Pocahontas. And in the movie Pocahontas, we learned that Native Americans really just wanted to paint with the colors of the wind. That's who natives were. I can tell you if you study history. In fact, for us as Texans, there was a reason the Texas Rangers became a thing. The reason was the Comanches. The Western Plains Indians were a very ferocious, fierce, warring people, and they took pride in how they eliminated their enemies. And I'm trying to filter some of what I'm saying because of some younger ears in the room, but here's the reality. There were some really amazing Native Americans that we can look at in American history. There's a lot of people that should be celebrated that don't get celebrated. But to say we're going to celebrate all Indigenous people and we're going to cancel Columbus, we have a lot of serious issues here. So let me back you up. If you look up Columbus today, one of the things that you will discover with a basic Google search, and if you don't know this yet, different search engines will produce different results for you. I do not use Google at all anymore. I will use DuckDuckGo or something else because they are incredibly biased with their algorithms and with the people in charge. Anyway, not to digress. These are the ideas we hear about Columbus. In fact, around the world, there are over 600 statues that were erected to Columbus over the last several hundred years because Columbus was a world hero. And yet, almost every single one of those statues has been torn down, has been destroyed, has been defaced on some level. And the reason you see there's red paint on these statues is one of the arguments is Columbus has blood on his hands. So this is supposed to be the blood of Indigenous people, what he did. This is one that, obviously, I don't support destroying any statue whatsoever. But as a farm boy who's used a hatchet, let me just say, if you can get a hatchet stuck in a statue, that's some impressive swinging of that hatchet, right? Like, I have no idea how you did that. It's not good. I'm not encouraging it, but these are the general ideas we see. In fact, even you'll find spray-painted messages around them. Kill the colonizer. Why, in the last 2 or 3 years, have we now turned on Columbus like we never have before? Or maybe, is there something we've discovered in the last 2 or 3 years, other than being woke? Is there something we discovered about Columbus that's brand new? Well, not really. The attacks and accusations are largely still the same, that Columbus practiced slavery, that he committed genocide. And let's just say, if we study Columbus and discover he is guilty of all the attacks he's accused of, then he probably is a little more thuggish than we learned growing up. And so I understand why some people want to cancel him. Now, I'm not in favor of canceling anybody historically, for lots of reasons. I think you learn from the past, you don't erase the past. Just be honest about it. If you think he's terrible, well, don't remove it. Just talk about how terrible he was. Let me give you perspective. I am a Christian, and unapologetically, I've been to Israel several times, and in Israel, if you go to Jerusalem outside the old city, there's a large cemetery in a valley. And in this large cemetery, the largest monument in that large city is a monument to Absalom. if you're familiar with the Bible, Absalom was King David's son who tried to violently overthrow his father and take the throne from him. Absalom was not a good guy in Bible or Christian history whatsoever. So why is the largest monument Absalom? Well, I was over there and I asked a friend, and by the way, they'll say, well, we don't really know who did this, although I would argue it's probably King David, right? Because again, if you know the Bible, after Absalom was finally killed, David mourns the death of his son, and David's commander comes to him and says, David, your men just laid their lives on the line for you. Some of them died, and you're mourning your son who betrayed you. Like, you need to get over this. Nonetheless, I think probably David's the one who had this monument erected. But I asked my friend in Israel, who's an archaeologist, very well connected, I said, hey, why is the largest statue in the cemetery a monument to a bad guy? Like, wouldn't you want to remove this monument to a bad guy? He said, well, Tim, that's ridiculous. He said, we don't have a monument there to celebrate him. We have a monument there that every time someone asks what that is, we can say how bad Absalom was. And I thought, that's the way you handle history, right? Just because someone has a monument doesn't mean we have to pretend like they're an amazing person. We can tell the true story of what happened and draw your own conclusions. Now, this is where I stand on Columbus, but here's the thing I want to point out. If we look at Columbus, and if we just took a basic survey in the room, if I said, what is one thing we all know about Columbus? Probably the one thing that we all, at least on some level, remember about Columbus was that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Okay? If you didn't learn that growing up, then you didn't have a good educational system. I don't know what to tell you. Right? This is what you should know about Columbus. Here's what I like to do, though. When someone likes to tell me how bad Columbus was, and he did all these bad things, I want to ask a question. The question I want to know is, on which voyage did Columbus do those bad things? This matters. Because most people only know about the 1492. He had one voyage. Nope. Columbus had 4 voyages to America. So was he bad on the first voyage, or was it the second voyage? Now, the reason I bring this up is if you don't know he had 4 voyages or what happened on those 4 voyages, how do you know he really did what you think he did? Right? If you don't know the story, how can you make these accusations? So, just to walk us through this. The first voyage was 1492. Now remember, he's Italian, but he's selling for the Spanish because they're the only ones that would fund the voyage. It's Isabel and Ferdinand and Isabel. Sometimes when you say it out of order, right, you have to back up and you're like, wait, okay, Ferdinand and Isabella, it's like the presidents or the states. Growing up, I learned the presidents in order. So if someone's like, what's the 16th president? I know it's Abraham Lincoln, but if I don't count, anyway, side note, Ferdinand and Isabella, they're the ones, right? They're king and queen. They're the ones that fund the voyage. Well, this is an Italian leading Spaniard, so there's going to be some tension coming up in the future. Nonetheless, he comes, and there's 3 vessels, Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. When they land, he thinks he's in India. Now, part of the reason, remember, he's going to India, they're trying to find a different trade route. The reason they're looking for a different trade route is there was actually Muslim wars, jihads, going on in Europe and Asia that actually blocked the land trade route, so they're trying to find a way, other than sailing around Africa. Columbus believed that the earth was a globe. He just didn't know there was another continent in the way, right? He's like, I'll just sail around. So that's this notion, where did the word Indians come from? Like, probably we remember this, right? He thought he was in India or somewhere of such nature. Well, when Columbus lands, the first tribe that he meets were the Taino Tribe. The Taino Tribe were a very peaceful, friendly tribe. He had great relations with them. And actually, he wrote back to the king and queen about this tribe he met. Here's what he told the king and queen. Your Highnesses may believe that there is no better nor gentler people in the world. Your Highnesses ought to rejoice that they will soon become Christians and that they will be taught the good customs of your kingdom. A better race there cannot be. Now, if one of the accusations that is made is he's a racist, I would just like you to explain, why does a racist say of a different people group, a better race there cannot be? Like, you're a pretty bad racist, right? If you're this white Italian guy, he's not a racist, okay, at all. Nonetheless, the Taino were the first tribe he met. One of the things that happened is one night when the men are on the boats, one of these ships runs aground because they had left a 12-year-old boy in charge of watching the depth, and he fell asleep. Anyway, he was flogged the next day. It was a sad story. But the ship runs aground, and they can't get the ship off. So Columbus says, well, we don't have room on these other 2 ships to get all the men on, so what are we going to do? They determine that they're going to leave men on one of these islands. And the Tainos say, hey, there's a great spot because there's spring water, so that you have natural water, so we can build a fort here. The Taino actually help his men build a fort. And before he leaves, they said, hey, but just so you know, we're not the only people on this island. There's another tribe, and they're actually really mean. They come and they war against us, and they actually eat people. Now, I encourage you, you can find this in Columbus's journal. Columbus is really skeptical at this moment. He's like, people don't eat people. It's the 1400s. Okay, he leaves to go back. His second voyage, when he returns, they landed on a different island. Now, the second voyage was a voyage not of exploration, it was a voyage of colonization. So there were 17 ships, there were roughly 1,200 men, and actually, before they embark, before they're leaving to come to this new world, so to speak, he told the king and queen, a lot of the people coming are not befitting the name Christian because they're not good people, they're not honorable people, and I'm afraid that when they get over there, they might do bad things. The king and queen said, that's not your problem, it's not your business, your job is to just get them across the ocean. So he says, okay, I can do that. So they get across the ocean. They land this time on a different island, but he says, we need to go back and check on our men. They go back to the first island. When they get to the first island, they find that the fort was destroyed, and they find the bodies of their men on the beach having been cannibalized. Okay? So you can only imagine what that's like, walking up and seeing people and it's like, he's missing a leg, and he's missing meat off his body. Columbus, as he's seeing this, is getting enraged. Rightfully so. His men are enraged. What happened to our men? Some of the Taino tribe come to him and they're furious. Like, what did you do? And they said, it wasn't us. We told you there was another tribe. And Columbus says, well, where is this tribe? We want them now. Columbus is ready to go on the warpath. Again, understandably so. If you found your friends, right, the people, your co-workers have been killed and eaten, yeah, I'm ready to go on the warpath. Understandable. The Taino actually help him find one of these villages. Now, the village of this cannibal tribe, the cannibal tribe was known as the Caribs, where the word Caribbean comes from. They were also known as the Cannibs, where the word cannibal comes from. So this is the tribe. So they go and they find this tribe, and Columbus and the Taino together. Okay, so you have the Spaniards and this native tribe together attack this village, and they conquer the village. At the end of conquering the village, there was 49 huts in the village, and there were actually several medical doctors and kind of educational professionals, so to speak, with Columbus, and they all kept journals or records of what happened. I'm going to read you part of a journal from one of the doctors who was with Columbus in this encounter. And when they went into the camp, they found 49 huts that were locked from the outside. So they were locking people in. When they opened the huts, they found women inside every one of these huts. And they began questioning, why were y'all locked in the huts? Here's part of the medical doctor's journal about what they discovered and what happened. As soon as these women learned that we abhor such kind of people because of their evil practice of eating human flesh, they felt delighted. They well knew they were safe in our company. So when the women found out that Columbus and his men don't eat people, they were like, woohoo, right? We dodged a bullet. We feel better about it. Here's where it gets interesting, though. These captive women told us that the Caribbean men use them with such cruelty as would scarcely be believed, and that they eat the children which they bear to them. It was a breeding farm. This is the Carib tribe. Now, let me point out, Columbus only ever approved of war against natives who first started a war with them by killing and eating their men. Okay, but people say, well, he committed genocide. Just because you have superior force and are better at war does not mean it's a genocide, right? If I go pick a fight with some big, strong bully and he whoops me, that's on me. I shouldn't have picked a fight with a big, strong bully, right? It's not Columbus's fault that they had boom sticks, right? Like, that's just the way it was. With it being said, at the end of them defeating this village, Columbus approved that the Caribbean men who they had captured, they could be enslaved. The only people Columbus ever approved enslaving were the people from the tribes that had first attacked them, and then when they conquered them in war, they enslaved them. Let's keep in mind, this is the 1400s. At the end of a war, if you win, there's only two options for the other team's survivors. That was it. But today people go, but he committed genocide. He enslaved the natives. There's a little more to that story. In fact, archaeologists have discovered different paintings and different caricatures from these early tribes. One of the things that's super interesting about these early tribes is there's actually a study done by a group of professors and some students from Washington University. There's another one done by professors. I don't remember what, there was one on the East Coast College. I don't remember which one it was. But they've actually documented that nearly every single tribe in North, Central, and South America prior to Columbus practiced cannibalism either as a form of ritual worship or for dietary purposes. Nearly every tribe did this kind of stuff. So this is not just totally unique for the Caribbean or the Carib tribe. This was part of the way the world was back then. Anyway, not to digress, this is part of where Columbus gets accused of genocide and enslaving natives. And there's a totally different story to that where he's not really the bad guy here. If you go to the third voyage, he is begged, the king and queen, please make me the governor. I want to be, I discovered these lands, I discovered these islands, I want to be the governor of them. So the king and queen finally relent. They say, okay, you can be the governor. Remember, he's Italian. The entire settlement colonization of these islands has been by the Spaniards. So you have an Italian leading Spaniards. Also worth noting, Columbus was an explorer at heart. So he didn't stay on the main colony to govern. He said, hey guys, here's the basic rules. And he went to explore. When he came back from exploring some of the other islands that were around, he discovered that some of the Spaniards had begun enslaving and raping and murdering some of these natives. And Columbus says, no, we're not doing that. Columbus had public executions of these Spaniards who did that. The problem was, when an Italian governor publicly executes Spaniards in front of their Spaniard friends, it didn't end up well. There was a revolt on the island. They stormed his location where he was staying. They overthrew the guards, and they actually captured Columbus. They put him in chains, put him in prison, and they sent him back before the king and queen, and they accused him of every kind of violent evil there was, that he had done all these awful, terrible things, and actually, basically everything they had been doing, they said, Columbus is the one who did it. Columbus, on his voyage back, he wrote in his journal lots of things, but here's one of the things he wrote that I think is very telling of his position. He says, but God is above, who with so much wisdom and power rescued Daniel and the 3 children, and who, if he please, can rescue me with a similar manifestation of his power. Columbus was absolutely someone who was a person of faith, who knew there was a God, who cried out to God for help. And when he's saying, right, like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those were people falsely thrown into the lion's den or the fiery furnace, and God rescued them. He said, I'm trusting in God to rescue me because I didn't do nothing wrong. He got back before the king and queen. He explained to them what happened. And the king and queen said, yeah, you are not guilty of this. He was exonerated, cleared of every charge brought against him. But the king and queen said, but it's probably better that we send one of our Spanish officials back to control these Spanish colonies, because probably this Italian thing, that probably was a little conflict. So he was cleared and funded to do a 4th voyage. But on the 4th voyage, this time it's a purely voyage of exploration. He wants to go see other islands, what's going on. After he gets back from this 4th voyage, and there's more to the story, I'm jumping ahead for the sake of time. When he gets back from the 4th voyage, he dies shortly after. There are a couple of really good biographies that were done of him. One was done by a gentleman, B.F. Morse. And here's part of what he wrote in his biography, that Columbus was a man alone with God against human stupidity and depravity, against greedy conquistadors, cowardly seamen, even against nature and the sea. This was the position of Columbus. Now, was Columbus perfect? Of course not, because nobody is. Nobody's perfect. With that being said, was Columbus guilty of what he's accused of today? Absolutely not. Now, guilty of many things, sure. Was he a sinner? Absolutely. However, what we are telling even students in schools today are things that are just not historically grounded. Even when professors make these attacks and accusations, largely they're quoting Howard Zinn, and those things are largely debunked. But here's the problem. If you don't even know the basic premise that he had 4 voyages, you sure don't know what he did on the 4 voyages, much less can you say whether he was a good or bad guy. But this is where we are seeing a lot of what is being taught to the rising generations. A lot of the things being told today are things that are done intentionally to try to demonize the history of America so that America looks really bad. So people say, well, we don't want the Constitution. We don't want the system of government. We want to overthrow it and do something new. And as we continue, let me point out, when you look at the College Board is the one who does all of the testing. So all of, for example, like the ACT, the SAT, but even the AP courses. All of the AP courses in public school, the College Board is the one who largely does that. David Coleman's the guy behind that. If you look at the AP history that is done in public schools, it's totally abysmal. But it's a little bit better than it used to be. Part of the reason it's a little bit better is if you back up, in 2014, they had a new revision of the U.S. AP history standards that came out. When these standards came out, it was 162 pages, and what was mind-boggling. Now, I'm going to show you some of what happened. It is a little bit better, but when I say a little bit better, instead of it being like a 97% bad, it's like a 93% bad, right? So it's a little better, but when those standards first came out, what was interesting is, again, this is American history. What was interesting is the things we did not say or the people that we did not think students needed to learn about. Now, this is AP history. Smartest kids, arguably in public school, are taking these courses. In these courses, we said they don't need to learn about the major founding fathers, right? They don't need to learn about the major battles or why did the revolution even begin. We don't get into that. Or if you go forward even to something like the Civil War, there is no mention of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. There's no mention of the Emancipation Proclamation or the Gettysburg Address or even the assassination of Lincoln or even the fact of who was leading in the Civil War or what their positions were. Or if you go forward past the Civil War, if you take World War II, for example, there's no mention of D-Day or the Battle of the Bulge or the Battle of Midway or not even Pearl Harbor is mentioned or the military generals involved. There's no mention of Eisenhower, no mention of Patton. There's no mention of MacArthur, no mention of Nimitz. None of this is mentioned, and not even the bad guys from World War II are included. There's no mention of Hitler, no mention of the Nazis or the Holocaust and all that was involved. All of that was removed from AP history. Okay? Which is also super telling when there are literally people acting like fascists, calling freedom lovers Nazis. That's super interesting, but it is a reflection of the fact they didn't learn jack nothing about who the Nazis actually were. Right? You know nothing about what you think you're talking about, but let me point out, right? So none of this is included. Well, then what did they think? If students don't need to learn that, what do we think students need to learn? Well, one of the things that's interesting is they do talk about that in World War II, America did drop an atomic bomb. But here was the conclusion that they wanted students to know about the atomic bomb. Here's what they said. The decision to drop the atomic bomb raised questions about American values. Okay? What questions did it raise? Right? I'm just curious. And what the argument today is, well, it was a really big bomb and it killed lots of people. Okay? That's true. It was a big bomb and it did kill lots of people. It was not even close to one of the most deadly bombing raids that we had during World War II. There were many in Germany that killed way more people than the atomic bombs did. Not to digress, but it's worth noting. If we're going to talk about the atomic bombs, do you know what we dropped in Japan before we started the bombing raids? We dropped leaflets warning the Japanese that we were going to send big planes with big bombs, and we actually identified the cities and targets in those cities on the back of these leaflets. More than 70 million leaflets were dropped. In fact, after we took over the island of Saipan, we took over the KSAI radio station, and every 15 minutes, we broadcast in Japanese into Japan, telling the Japanese people, you need to surrender. Tell your emperor to surrender. And remember at this point, too, in Pacific Theater, the Germans have surrendered, Italians have surrendered, the Japanese literally have no allies left, and they've lost every single battle, every skirmish along the way. They've lost everything. But in the midst of this, we as Americans didn't want to prolong the war. We didn't want more people to die. So we're doing everything we can, encouraging them to surrender. In Japan at that time, they practiced military Shintoism. And the idea was, in military Shintoism is it's more honorable for your ancestors, for the country, that you would die in defense of your country. That's honorable to your ancestor and the country. If you surrender, you dishonor your ancestors, you dishonor the country, and that's unacceptable in Japan. Well, that was encouraging them not to want to surrender. But again, let me point out, the question was, we need to ask questions about American values. Remember, this is the point they were making in the AP history. So here's rolling back up to the atomic bombs. If you look at the atomic bombs, 2 bombs were dropped. And approximately 150,000 people died from each bomb, because there was between 70 to 80,000 people that died from the initial blast, and then 70 to 80,000 people died from radiation. And so that was between both bombs. So you're talking about 300,000 people. What were the other options? Because we're saying, well, we shouldn't have dropped bombs. Okay, well, if we don't drop bombs, Harry Truman, who's now the president at this time, because right, FDR passes away, Harry Truman's in charge. So Harry Truman now is the guy who has to figure out what we're going to do. And so when Harry Truman says, how do we get the Japanese to surrender? He had officers tell him, well, if we do a land invasion like we did over, right, at D-Day, Normandy, if we do a ground invasion, we're probably going to have to kill between 5 to 10 million Japanese before they are ready to surrender. And in order for us to be able to kill that many Japanese, it might cost us anywhere between 1 to 4 million Allied lives and up to 1 million American lives. So we're talking that 15 million people might have lost their lives if we did a ground invasion. These were the estimates. Harry Truman at that point says, do we have any other options? And one of his officers says, well, sir, last week, we had the first successful test of this really big bomb. He says, well, let's try the really big bomb. Okay? Here's what's also worth noting about this, right? The really big bomb that was tested, the Enola Gay carries the first one, right? Drops the first one, bomb goes off. And this was telling them, we don't want to continue this war, but we have more bombs. We don't want to do a land invasion, more people get hurt. All this is happening. Again, remember, the AP says we need to question American values. The second one drops, and we were supposed to drop a third one in a matter of 3 days later. Well, 3 days came, and we didn't drop a third one. Why? Because they finally were in negotiations, and they said, we can be ready in the morning. We said, you have till the morning. So we didn't drop the third bomb. Here's where some people say, yeah, but after the first bomb, they were ready to surrender. No. The conditions of their surrender was they would stop fighting, but they got to keep all of the ground and land they had conquered, and they got to keep their military. And we said, no, we're not doing that. You have to give up your military, and you have to give the land back to the people you took it from. Those were conditions. Now, again, this is what was happening when people today say, but they wanted to surrender, we bombed them anyway. They weren't really ready to surrender because their terms were not really acceptable. Nonetheless, one of the things that is worth noting, military historians have documented, if you look at the Japanese, part of it in their military Shintoism, they were a very brutal people, the way they treated others outside of Japan. Right? One of the things that, again, well documented, more than 10 million Chinese were executed by the Japanese. The Japanese went to Korea, they took comfort women, which we would know as sex slaves. There's a lot of things they did, even to Americans, a lot of mistreatment. One military historian, or actually, military historians have documented, there was one prisoner of war camp where more people were beheaded in one prisoner of war camp than both atomic bombs killed combined. Okay? But what our students in American public schools are learning is we need to question American values. Okay? This is where we are seeing problems. We are being dishonest in the story we tell. And if you're honest, we can acknowledge, look, America wasn't perfect. We have made lots of mistakes along the way. But if at the end of learning about World War II, you think we should question American values, you have a really bad teacher. Right? You've done a really poor job covering this history, and yet this is largely where we are, and it falls under this notion of deconstruction. We're trying to tear down the past and replace it with some other thought that didn't actually happen. So much so that if you look at different states, they're reviewing their history standards, and different states do this differently, where they have state boards of education, or their legislature does this. And for many states, it's every couple years, but in Minnesota, for example, they decided they wanted to redo their history standards. So their state legislature last year decided they're going to rewrite their history standards. And in their history standards, they said, there's some things we don't think students need to learn about American history anymore. So these are removed from American history standards. They said students no longer need to know about the American Revolution, about the Civil War, about World War I, World War II, or about the Holocaust. They don't need. This was passed into law and signed by the governor last year. This is where Minnesota is. Now, it's worth asking, if you're not going to cover that, what are you going to cover in law? They said we will use the 1619 Project, and we will emphasize the white supremacy, systemic racism. They go through like literally documenting all of this nonsense and finish with critical race theory, okay, which is a known Marxist ideology. This is what is happening right now, and by the way, this is where we have to be very, very careful with the next generation, because right now, when you talk to most students, and I'm saying most, hopefully not in Idaho, but when you talk to students around the nation, students can tell you more bad things about America than good things about America. Why? Because that's what they focus on for the rising generation, is how bad America is. You can only think America is so bad if you don't have any context of the rest of the world. When you recognize how everybody else does it, I tell people all the time, if you want to get perspective, I tell parents, right, here's one of the best things you can do. You need to have your kids find a church that's taking a mission trip to a third world nation. And let them go to a third world nation for a week or two. Let them go see what it's like somewhere else, because most people don't recognize how blessed we are because they've never been anywhere else. When you go somewhere else, you realize, wow, America is a lot more special than I realized. Nonetheless, what we are promoting today is absolutely a lot of Marxist and communist ideology. This is the problem. This is actually part of also critical race theory. It's rooted in critical theory, which is a Marxist ideology. This is where a lot of it comes from, and this is what a lot of groups are actually basing the premise of their group on those notions, on the anarchy, the chaos, the Marxism, the communism. One of the mottos that has become popularized is riding rebellion and radicalization. When that's your motto, I got a really good perspective of where this is going to end up, and it's not going to be good. But this is exactly what critical race theory promotes and teaches, and a lot of people today, we hear the title critical race theory a lot more. Let me give you the idea of a definition. There was an article written really when this was first becoming prominent a year or two ago, and I think it's still one of the best descriptions I've heard of it. It says, it takes as its starting point that America was founded to protect and preserve slavery, and that the American constitutional system is the source of our society's ills, foremost among them being racism. Right? Because what we're hearing, what students are learning today is America is a fundamentally racist nation. We're not. We are one of the strongest anti-racist nations that's ever existed in history. I'll get to that later. Nonetheless, the argument is America is very, very racist. Well, why are we racist? The point from critical race theory is, well, it's the American constitutional system. So the Constitution, that's why we're racist. Well then, if we want to solve racism, what do we have to do? You got to get rid of the Constitution. Guys, last year, if you go to Washington, D.C., if you want to actually go see physically the U.S. Constitution, you go to the National Archives, because that's where it's housed. You actually can get online on the National Archives, and you can see it online. Last year, the National Archives, if you went and looked on their website, they actually had a harmful language warning on the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Right. Right. What do we think is harmful in this? I'll come to some of that in a second, but here's the point. This is literally the nonsense that is happening right now. And again, it goes back to the notion, well, why do we think those documents are harmful? Because we think the guys who gave us those documents were really bad, and therefore what they did is really bad. Let me back you up. Let's start with the Declaration, okay? We're going to start there and kind of unfold going forward. These are the signers, or known as the signers of the Declaration, right? This painting was done portraying the presentation of the Declaration, because these five guys around the table, that was a committee of five that drafted the Declaration. And today, a lot of people don't really understand the Declaration very well anymore. Let me give you the very simple crash course into this. The Declaration was where we told King George we no longer wanted to be British, but here's the way it works. The Declaration was in essence the greatest breakup letter ever written. Because in the Declaration, we said it's not us, it's all you, and we listed 27 reasons why he was the problem. That's a great breakup letter, right? That is what the Declaration is. And in the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson was the chief author of the Declaration, and Thomas Jefferson was 33 years old when he wrote the Declaration. I am coming up on 40 years old. And I remember as a teenager, right? I mean, 30-year-olds, like, those are old people. And then I hit my 30s. And I realized a couple things. 30s are not that old, number one. But number two, you're not inherently brilliant when you're 30. So for a 33-year-old to write the Declaration, that really is impressive, how well he was thinking and how well he understood things. But here's something that I think we recognize generally and understand. Phrase will know. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. That's something probably most of us memorized growing up. Okay? If you didn't, you need to, right? This is the premise of where our nation was built. Our nation was built on this philosophy. This is the foundation we were built on, and it starts like this. We hold these truths to be self-evident. This is important because we live in a culture today that is not sure truth even exists anymore, right? We don't even believe biology exists anymore, right? We don't believe in gender or whatever. Like it's crazy. We have made truth subjective. It's up to how you feel, what you want, what you think. No, there is a reality, and the Founding Fathers acknowledged this. There is some basic truth, and these were things they acknowledged to be true. They said that all men are created equal, that we have rights that come from God, and government exists to protect those rights. That's the foundation we were built on. Now, let me also point out, they said that these truths were self-evident. Self-evident means obvious. You know, if you've ever thought about this, I would point out that that's actually an inaccurate statement. Those are not obvious truths. Go to any major Muslim nation in the Middle East and see if they believe men and women are equal. Go to India, where they still have a caste system, and see if they believe that all people are created equal. See, it's interesting. We in America have grown up with an American ideology that we think, well, of course, everybody should know this. This was revolutionary when it was written, because this was not a self-evident truth to most. It was the Founding Fathers. It was not to most people in the world. The idea that we have God-given rights, yeah, try that in China or in Russia, right? We can go down the list. These are not self-evident truths. They're only obvious truths to people who are familiar with the principles of the Bible. If you understand the Bible, then you know that we were all made in God's image. And so we're all kids of God. We're all sons and daughters, right? And in that perspective, we're made in His image. Or the idea that God's the one who gives, government doesn't give us our rights. God does. Government's only role is to protect our God-given rights. Like, that's your job. You punish the bad guys, you reward the good guys. It's not very complicated in my perspective. With it being said, what's interesting about this is today, there are literally states and school districts who say that students are not allowed to memorize those words anymore because those are hateful, divisive, and racist words. What in the world do we think is hateful, divisive, and racist? They actually point to that first main point, that we are all created equal. And what they say is, well, the Founding Fathers were talking about equality for like lords, nobles, serfs, peasants, so like no class system. But they all had slaves, therefore it was only equality for white people, not for black people, so it is racist, so we shouldn't keep it anymore. Okay, you only can make that argument if you haven't actually read original documents. If you go back and read the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, we actually have an original copy of this. Really amazing. When Thomas Jefferson died in 1826, there was people who went through and found all the writings they could of his, and they found the original draft of the Declaration. In 1828, they did what's roughly known as an ink lift, where they put another document on top, they wet that document down, and they lift ink up off the original, and then from that copy, they made other copies. We have one of the early copies from that original copy. So we actually have two of these, but we have this original one. What's interesting is these were all of Thomas Jefferson's ideas that included even more grievances than the 27 that were in the final draft of the Declaration, but it included all the problems we had with the king. Well, when it goes before the Continental Congress, John Hancock was the president. He said, we're only going to include what everybody unanimously agrees to. Because if any colony has a disagreement, it would allow the king to be able to come in and pull that colony apart from our disagreement. So we will only include in the final draft what is unanimous. So they begin going through this line after line after line. If you read the original draft, the longest or the largest grievance in the original draft was a grievance against the slave trade and against slavery. And when you read this, up at the top, and again, you can look this up online. Actually, it's very important for you to look it up online. One of the things that is very significant in our modern culture is we have to stop taking somebody's word for what is true. We have gotten ourselves in the position we're in because we've trusted the wrong people for way too long. Right? We trusted our teachers, we trusted our politicians, we trusted news media, we trusted the internet. We have to change that perspective. Actually, in the Bible, in Acts 17, the Apostle Paul was teaching to a group known as the Bereans. And the Bereans did not believe anything Paul told them until they looked it up for themselves. And Paul said, you guys are amazing. No one's ever going to mislead you because you always discover truth for yourself. I would point out, if we had more people seeking truth to confirm it for themselves, we would have less of the nonsense we're having in the world around us today. Okay, so with all that being said, don't take my word for this. Homework. Go look this up. But when you do, here's what the grievance says. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself. And actually, let me put the text up to make it easier to read. It says, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating his most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him. Now remember, we're talking about the king. Okay, the king has violated the rights about the people in Africa, never offended them, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Now, those are words that are actually underlined in Jefferson's original draft. Okay, so I'm trying to keep some of the actual historic accuracy in what he says. The Christian king of Great Britain determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. In the original draft, the word men is fully capitalized and it's bold. The only other words fully capitalized in the original draft of the Declaration were United States of America. But when he talked about the people who were being brought to America as slaves, he said these men. He defended the humanity of every single person that was being enslaved. That's very significant because we read the Declaration and all men are created equal, and today people say, but he only meant the white men. No, he didn't. Go back and read the stinking document that he wrote. He said that men did include everyone, and by the way, mankind, right? This wasn't like leaving out and excluding women. Don't get woke on me, right? Mankind, okay? Where men should be bought and sold, but here's where it gets even more interesting. In this grievance, he actually goes even further. He says, he has prostituted his negative, suppressing every legislative attempt. There are 4 states that I know of that prior to 1774 had passed laws, and really it was 1772 and 1773 is when they did this. They passed laws to end the slave trade and oppose slavery in their states. And in 1774, the king vetoed all those laws because he said, you're British colonies. As British colonies, you can't end slavery in your colony. Pennsylvania was one of the colonies who ended slavery or ended the slave trade in their colony. When the king vetoed this, Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania says, this is just one more reason we should separate from the king because he won't even let us end the slave trade in our own colony. This was a big deal to many founding fathers. When this went before the actual Continental Congress and they voted on it, there were 2 states that opposed it. And you can read about this in greater detail in Jefferson's own writings. He says there were 2 states that opposed it. It was Georgia and South Carolina. He says, much to his regret, he said he wished the other states had fought harder to try to persuade them and convince them. But those 2 states, he wrote in his journal, or in his kind of recollections of it, he says the reason they said they did not believe it should be included is they had not tried to end slavery or the slave trade to this time. So that wasn't something for them that was an issue that was causing them to separate from the king. However, there were 13 colonies represented. Only 2 opposed it. What that means is 11 of the original 13 supported that amendment. The vast majority of America supported the anti-slavery position. And today, right, if we look at the American Revolution, we're largely told, yeah, but, right, these were largely racist, bigoted founding fathers. Let's just point out, if we do a very quick run through the American Revolution, in 1775, this is where we're leading into the shot heard around the world, right? This is where you have Paul Revere, who makes his famous midnight ride. as Paul Revere is making this famous midnight ride, we know that Paul Revere was not the only guy who rode that night. William Dawes, there were some other people who rode that night. But throughout the course of the Revolution, there actually were lots of people who made famous midnight rides. There was women who made some famous midnight rides, Sybil Weddington being one of them. Because anytime the British were going to a new area, oftentimes Americans wanted to warn their comrades, right? Their friends, their other patriots that the British were coming, and so they would send riders. One of the guys who became famous making one of these famous midnight rides was a guy named Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell was a black patriot who was fighting in the cause of liberty, but what's more interesting about Wentworth Cheswell is not only was he a black patriot, he was a black politician. Wentworth Cheswell was elected in a white community and actually served for nearly 50 years. He served 49 years in a variety of elected positions. Now again, he's from a white community. So how in the world were racist, bigoted people tricked into electing a black man for 49 years? It actually doesn't make sense across the board when we study the whole story. See, what happens so often is people take where maybe there were some racist places in America. That's true. But we take where there were racist places and we say all of America did this. No, all of America did not do that. In fact, the vast majority of America went in a very different direction. But let me keep going. Paul Revere makes his famous midnight ride. Specifically, he's looking to warn John Hancock and Sam Adams because the British had orders to kill those two guys because they were leaders in the cause of liberty. So Paul Revere rides to the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark. Jonas Clark was known to be the friend and mentor of many founding fathers, but he was a pastor. Well, the next morning, the British show up. There's more than 700 British. They're up against 73 Americans. But the 73 Americans who were there, all 73 Americans, were from the church of the Reverend Jonas Clark. And what's also interesting is of the guys there that day, you had white guys like John Robbins and black guys like Prince Estabrook, who were in that 73 people who were there that day. Now, we don't know all 73 people, but we do know many guys who were there, and it included white and black people. Now, it's also worth noting, they were going to church together. Well, I thought in early America everybody was racist. No, there definitely were racist people. Not everybody was. In fact, largely, if you look at all of the New England states, they were so much better. Now, apart from New York, which New York has problems of their own today anyway, so they're just carrying on. Nonetheless, pretty much every other New England state did a really good job. With that being said, Prince Estabrook was someone historically who was very well known and documented. This is actually a marker to Prince Estabrook close to the spot where it happened. Even today, they have a statue of acknowledging Prince Estabrook as being one of the first black patriots in the cause of the Revolution. But it doesn't stop there, because if you go to the summer, June 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is 6 weeks later. The Battle of Bunker Hill, this is a famous painting done. What very few people know, and let me back up. This is not the only painting that was done. There were other paintings that highlight some of the story even better, but this is the most famous painting. Over on the right is a guy named Peter Salem. He's standing behind a guy named Thomas Grosvenor. Peter Salem was known as the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and here are other paintings or other lithographs done of Peter Salem. Now, you can see that's clearly a black man holding a gun. Why was he the hero of the battle? Because in the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British charged the hill the first time. The Americans repelled them. Heavy British casualties. The British regrouped. They charged a second time. The Americans repelled them. Heavy British casualties. Americans largely were unscathed in this. Did very well for the Americans. The British charged a third time, and the Americans ran out of ammunition. The Americans are about to be overwhelmed, but there was one soldier who had one shot left. And Peter Salem stood up, and he shot the commander who was leading the charge. And when he shot the commander, it broke the charge off, because the men were trying to help care for their commander, and the Americans were able to escape largely unscathed in that third attack. He saved their lives. In fact, he was known as the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. It was a black patriot. Now, black patriot fighting with white guys? Yeah, in fact, he wasn't the only black patriot there who was noted. Salem Poor was another man who was there, and Salem Poor was on the front lines for much of what happened. At the end of this skirmish, there were 13 different officers who signed a commission note saying that Salem Poor should be promoted for his bravery on the battlefield, because I think the order says, when the battle was at its thickest and terror reigned, he stood undaunted and courageous and encouraged the men, and on it goes. But they talk about his bravery. 13 white officers said, we need to promote this man. He should be a leader because of how courageous he was. Now, let's not stop there, because if you go to December 1776, when Washington crosses the Delaware, right? The famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, well, this painting was done over in Europe. But when it was done in Europe, interesting, if you study some of the history, it was done symbolizing the uniqueness of America, because in the boat, there actually is men and women. There actually are soldiers, but there's trappers, but also there's a black man, Prince Whipple. Prince Whipple was one of the guys noted to have traveled with Washington during this battle, and he wasn't the only black man. There's also stories of Oliver Cromwell who was there. There were, all throughout the Revolution, black heroes involved in what we did. If you go to 1777, this is actually one of my favorite stories. The American General Charles Lee was the second in command only to Washington, and Charles Lee got captured. Well, when Charles Lee got captured, we wanted to rescue him, but the only way you're getting the second in command back from the British, you have to do a prisoner of war exchange. So we had to get General Richard Prescott to do a prisoner of war exchange because he was the British high-up second in command. The problem was, to get to General Prescott, he was on an island inside a fort guarded by British troops, and the island was surrounded by a British fleet. Well, Colonel William Barton, who I don't think we're related, but since it's 2022 and we get to identify how we want to, I'm pretty sure he's related. So, Colonel William Barton says, guys, talks to his men, says, guys, here's what I'm thinking. It might work. If we go at night, let's find a night when good cloud cover, so the moon's covered up, it's dark. If we get in some rowboats and we cover our oars in cloth, and we row very silently, we might can get past the British fleet undetected. And then, if we do it late enough at night, where it's right before the shift of the guard, where the guards who are there, they're getting tired, they're getting lulled, we can go and we can get those guards, and if we can knock them out and subdue them without making any noise, and if nobody hears us, then we can get inside the fort. And if we get inside the fort, then we can find the officers' quarters. And if we can make it to the officers' quarters, then if we can find where General Prescott is, we can get into the general, and if we can get the general without being noticed, then we can try to get back to the boat. And if we get to the boat without being noticed, we can make it back. And if we do that, then we can do a prisoner of war exchange. Right. He says now, one thing to complicate this is we would have to do this without taking any guns. Because if there was even an accidental discharge, the noise would alert the British to what we're doing, so we could take clubs or hatchets or knives or bayonets, but we are not taking any guns with us. Who wants to go? He called for volunteers. There were 20 white men and 20 black men who volunteered for this mission. This was what we became known as the first Special Force Operation, right? Genuinely. The hero of this operation was a black man named Jack Sisson. Worth noting, as they decide they're going to do this, they're able to get past the British fleet. Incredibly, right? Miraculously. They're able to do the guards. They then get in to the fort, and they find the officers' quarters, but General Prescott is inside, and the door is barred from the inside. So you can beat down the door, but obviously it's going to make a lot of noise, it's going to wake people up, so what are we going to do now? So Jack Sisson steps up and says, everybody get out of the way. And Jack Sisson backs up. There's two accounts of this, and they're a little bit different, but very similar. I'll tell you both. So it says he backed up, and one account says he charged the door head first. The second account says he charged the door with his head and shoulder. I feel like that's probably more accurate, but I wasn't there, I don't know. So it says he broke the door off the hinges and broke the beam behind it. So just like like NFL linebacker, he's the guy you want on your team, right? Just lights everybody up. So he blows this door off. Well, at this point, as there's now a lot of noise, the general is awake and he gets up, and what's going on? And as they're trying to get over to subdue the general starts to cry out. So here's where the two accounts come in. Jack Sisson runs over, and one account says he opened up his palm and he slapped the general unconscious. It says he then picked him up and put him on his shoulder and said, all right, guys, let's go, and led the men back to the boat. The second account says he opened up his hand and he backhanded the general unconscious. He then picked him up under his arm and said, let's go. So full disclosure, I have no idea if it was a front hand or backhand slap. We do know he got knocked unconscious, and we do know with one arm he picked him up and carried him out, right? This is actually what happened. Well, Jack Sisson the hero of this operation. This became known as the first Special Force operation, and this was to capture the British second-in-command, to do a prisoner of war exchange, to rescue the American second-in-command, and the hero was a black patriot. Guys, I can literally go through nearly every battle of the American Revolution highlighting the black heroes that today we've never heard about, but the point is they are there. In fact, if you go to the last major battle of the Revolution, 1781, it was the Battle of Yorktown. And Marquis de Lafayette was a French major general. When he was 19 years old, he came to America. He starts working for the cause of liberty. He actually is a big help in helping France become an ally force in America. But one of the things that Washington tells Lafayette, that I want you, part of your job, I want you to track the movement of the British officers, and specifically, I want you to track Lord Cornwallis, because at this point Cornwallis was in America, and he says if we can capture Cornwallis, we can probably end this war. So Lafayette decided the best way for him to be able to have the intelligence to know the movement of the officers or Cornwallis, he said, I need to develop a spy ring. And the spy ring he developed was a spy ring of black patriots. He said, I want black soldiers in my spy ring because they will have the best access to the British camp, because they can pretend to be escaped slaves seeking help from the British, and while they're there, they can listen and gather information, come back and report to me, I'll report to Washington. Well, one of the guys who worked for him and became the best spy in all of his spy ring was a guy named James Armistead. James Armistead, when he joined up in the Revolution to be a spy, at this point he had been a slave. And actually some of his story is, if you remember, Benedict Arnold was the famous American general who then became the famous American traitor and then was a British general. Well, as a British general, Arnold attacked Richmond, Virginia in January of 1781. When Richmond fell, at this point James Armistead, he was a slave. His master lived in Richmond, but James saw what the British were doing to Richmond. And he said, I want to help. So he asked his master, can I sign up for the military? His master said, that's fine. At that point, the law in Virginia was, if you fought for a year, you could have your freedom. And his master knew it. Master, hey, it's no problem. You go fight if you want to fight for liberty. So James signs up to fight. When he signs up, Lafayette sees him. He's like, hey, here's what I think you could do to be really helpful. I need you to be a spy. And he said, I want you to go to a local British camp, pretend to be an escaped slave, and gather intel, come back to me. So he went to the local British camp. It was the camp of Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold saw this new black escaped slave serving in his camp, but he served like really well. So Benedict Arnold said, you know, someone who serves that well shouldn't be serving the common soldier. He should be serving in the officer's tent. So he invited James Armistead to come serve in the officer's tent. Come to find out, Benedict Arnold shortly after makes James Armistead his personal assistant. This becomes very significant because Benedict Arnold gets reassigned under Cornwallis, and he took his personal assistant James with him. So James is now in the main British camp, hearing all of the British plans because he's in the officer's tent. He's getting word back to Lafayette, who gets word to Washington. Well, Cornwallis realizes that the Americans are now operating differently, and they have to have the intelligence, because every time the British are going to move somewhere, the Americans showed up at the right time at the right place. So Cornwallis actually calls for an officers' meeting. And he calls the men in, and reports are he just let them have it. He said, I don't know who's letting word leak, but there's a spy in this camp, and one of you has loose lips, and one of you is letting a spy know, and this spy's getting out. And James Armistead hears the whole thing, and Cornwallis just unloads on him. He says, you go find that spy, and we're going to execute that spy, and we're going to write a message, nobody does this, and you find that man right now. He sends the officers out. He says, James, you stay here. Now, if you're in James's position, right, like this is a nervous moment. And Cornwallis says, James, I don't know who I can trust anymore. But I feel like you're one person that probably hates the Americans as much as I do. So I'm going to confide in you. Literally. He says, James, he says, we're going to need help if we're going to beat the Americans. So I'm going to ask you to do something special for me. He says, I need someone who can go spy in the American camp. And I think if you pretend to be a slave seeking refuge, they would take you in. So I'm going to ask a personal favor. And right, James has to play the whole game. He has to play it well. So you can imagine, right? He's like, oh, the Americans, oh, I mean, for you, I would do it. Okay, I'll help. He pretends to spy for the British. The whole time he's actually spying for the Americans. He is the first double spy in American history. James Armistead is the one that found out that Cornwallis was going to Yorktown. In fact, there's a letter from Lafayette to Washington. You can read in the writings of Lafayette, there's a letter where he tells Washington. He says, remember I told you I had a new spy in the British camp and it was the best spy we've ever had? This spy is now in Cornwallis' camp, and this spy has found out that Cornwallis is moving with several thousand of his men and they're going to Yorktown. And Lafayette wrote to Washington and said, this might be the very moment we've waited for, where Providence will allow us to capture Cornwallis and end the war. Well, sure enough, Washington moves in, they capture Cornwallis, they end the war. Let me point out, the only reason Washington knew where to go was because of the work of a black patriot. This was the last major battle of the Revolution. The last battle of the Revolution could not have been won without the work of this black patriot. And let me now connect some dots for you. If you look at the question, or try to find the answer to the question, when did the Revolution begin? John Adams says the Revolution did not begin with a shot around the world or at Concord Bridge. He said the Revolution actually began when the first blood was shed at King Street. King Street was the Boston Massacre. If you remember your history, the first person killed in the Boston Massacre was a black man named Crispus Attucks. Why this matters is, according to John Adams, the Revolution started with the death of a black patriot, and the Revolution was won because of the intelligence work of a black patriot. You can't even tell the story of America in the Revolution without including the black heroes. Now, why don't we know these guys today? Enter main bad guy, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a leader in the progressive movement. In fact, in 1902, Woodrow Wilson, as a professor, wrote a 5-volume set of American history. In this 5-volume set, A History of the American People, he went kind of systematically, chronologically, very detailed, and because he was a noted professor, this got him promoted where he became the president of a university, then he became the president of America. So this really moved him up the ladder. But this book, after he was president, a lot of people in the progressive education system said, you know what? Our progressive hero has this 5-volume history set. We should take his 5-volume history set and make that the basis of education in America, like history education. We should use his history book. In case you don't really know a lot about Woodrow Wilson's positions, when he was the president and World War I breaks out, one of the things that he did was he resegregated the military. Because at the end of the Civil War, when the Union Army won, the military at that point was black and whites fighting together. And that's the way it was all the way up until World War I. Woodrow Wilson gets there and says, yeah, we don't need black and white people together. Let's go ahead and separate them. He resegregates what was going on. In fact, a lot of things happened in America in this regime. In the White House, he showed the very first ever film in the White House, gave it 2 showings. It was called Birth of a Nation, which was a recruiting film for the KKK. During his leadership, his administration, there actually was a rebirth of the KKK. There were open marches in Washington, D.C., where reportedly some of his own staff showed up and marched with the KKK openly in D.C. This is who this guy is and where he's from. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is he was a noted and known racist. So, if a noted and known racist writes a history of America, do we think he's going to tell it honestly? Or maybe is there going to be a slant on it? Well, if you look at his 5-volume set, he removed every single black person from American history. And let me give you perspective of why that's even crazier than it sounds right now. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person in the entire 1800s. Lincoln did not have more photographs than Frederick. Frederick Douglass was a big deal, leader of the abolition movement. His story was so well known. Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver. You had a lot of really important, significant, known, and noted black leaders. And Woodrow Wilson says, we're not including any of them. None of them are going to be part of this book. Now, in his book, he does acknowledge that black people do exist. And he says, just in case you don't know what black people look like, he shows some pictures of black people. But the pictures he shows of black people are a little more reminiscent of, if you've seen like the stages of evolution, right from goo to you, and there's like that Neanderthal section. This is literally what he is depicting in his book, is this Neanderthal graphic. Now, let me ask this question. Why in the world would Woodrow Wilson have this perspective of black people? This is important. He was following the science. Because who was the noted scientist at the time? Okay, I'm not going to get into following the science today, because that's a rabbit trail that, oh my gosh. right? Although I see a lot of you not wearing masks and I feel unsafe right now, so if you please all mask up, no, I'm kidding, it's ridiculous, okay? With it being said, Charles Darwin wrote his book, Origin of Species. Most people know the book Origin of Species. I will point out, the book was not called Origin of Species. That's only part of the title. The full title, Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Favored races? Yeah, so guess what Woodrow Wilson thought he was doing? Following the science. Okay? All kinds of ridiculousness, but here's the point. Woodrow Wilson is the reason largely today that most Americans have no idea the contributions of so many different people or groups of people in the course of America. It used to be that America was known as the melting pot because people of all different races, creeds, nationalities, genders, we all contributed together to make this a better place. And today we're told, oh no. See, this is where if you look at the 1619 Project and they say, yeah, but America was founded on slavery. And articles that follow this lineup. Let me finish, and we're going to do Q&A at the end if you guys want to talk anymore, and I'm happy to do some questions and answers with you. But this is what is largely being said today about America. This is what kids are largely learning. So let me finish by giving you an apologetic of why this is such nonsense looking at America, and why America really is one of the best anti-slavery nations in the history of the world. If you look back at the fact of the slave trade, now the slave trade did exist, but it's worth noting that America was never a world leader in the global slave trade, ever. The slave trade was a real thing, and America did participate. However, if you look at the slave trade lasted for roughly 400 years. Approximately 12.7 million people were taken out of Africa during that in the slave trade. There have been really good documents that people have gone back and done the history. They've documented actually so many of the vessels involved in this, and actually the ports that were used and where they left and where they arrived and what it looked like. And here's what, now I'm going to show you things. This is not even historically disputed. Nobody even argues these numbers. Everybody agrees these are the most accurate numbers we have for what happened. It's just that people don't know what these numbers are. Here's what we know, is that looking at the people that came out of Africa, and by the way, if you notice these red lines and arrows, like that's showing the sheer volume of where things went. But 43% of the slaves went to Portugal or Brazil, 24% went to Great Britain, 15% went to Spain, 11% went to France, 5% went to the Dutch, 2.5% went to the United States, and 1% went to Denmark. Okay, what it means is that America absolutely did participate in the great evil of the slave trade. What it also means is America was nowhere close to being a leader in the global slave trade. It's also worth noting, when it says 2.5 million came to the United States, not all of those went to American colonies, because you also had French and Spanish colonies at that time in North America. So, not to digress, but America definitely did participate. But here's where it's worth noting, this was a global condition. One of the things that is mind-boggling to me is when people say, but America was evil because of slavery. Okay. I don't disagree that slavery was bad. However, if the argument is that's what fundamentally makes America evil, my question is, what nation in the history of the world never had slaves? You're going to have a hard time finding one. Because the history of every single people group is at some point they were enslaved, and at some point they enslaved everybody else. This is the story of humanity, but here's where America becomes special. If you look solely at America, America was the first nation in the world to ban the slave trade. Thomas Jefferson signed that law March 2nd, 1807. Now, some people say, actually, England was first. England signed the law March 25th, 1807, but England's law went into effect right then. America's law didn't go into effect until January 1st, 1801. So people say, yeah, so America technically was second. Here's the deal. Second place in this race is still really good, because that's before basically everybody else. However, I will point out, I think arguably we're still the first to actually abolish the slave trade, because January 1st, the law said nobody ever can do any of this ever again. And actually it got better, because we actually sent ships over off the coast of Africa to return the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Muslim slave trade vessels that were headed to North America. So we actually had a navy there to fight against the slave trade, but here's where it becomes interesting. That was January 1st, 1808 is when this takes full effect. England's law went into effect on March 25th, 1807, but in England's law, it allowed provision that if there are captains who already have contracts, they can fulfill all of their contracts, just no new contracts. So England actually was, and we can document this, they actually were still in the slave trade business after January 1st, 1808. So America not only signed the law first, we truly were the first ones to fully abolish the slave trade, and we were the fourth nation to ban slavery. Now, we did it in 1865, the 13th Amendment. England did it in 1833, and then Denmark, and then France did it. But here's what's also worth noting about this. America ended slavery at the end of the Civil War, where more than 600,000 people died. America is the only nation in the world where white people fought other white people, and at the end they freed all the black people. Right? That's a big deal. Because if you look at the rest of the world, slavery to this day still exists in much of the world. It exists in Africa, it exists in Europe, it exists in Asia. Much of the world, slavery is still a thing. South America, it's still a thing. In fact, if you look at the United Nations, one of the crazy stats, there's 193 member nations that were part of the UN this last year. One of the crazy things about it is 94 of those nations still have not passed laws to ban slavery in their nation. Slavery is legal in so many nations of the world. It's estimated there's more than 40 million people still enslaved in the world today. Slavery is still a real deal. And by the way, this map is a heat map showing some of the nations who are the worst offenders, the worst violators, but also it shows some of the nations who are the very best. And down here on the bottom, those taking the most action. Number 1 is the Netherlands. Number 2 is United States of America. Now this map is by percentage, not by volume. So the Netherlands do more by percentage, but by volume, America dwarfs everybody else, and it's not even close. America does more to fight human trafficking, to fight slavery and sex slavery than any other nation anywhere in the world. And what that means, if you look at America, America started legal opposition to slavery before any other nation in the world. America paid a higher price in ending slavery than any other nation in the world. And America does more today than virtually any other nation to oppose slavery in the world today. What that means is we have one of the best anti-slavery records in the history of the world. But this is not what your kids and grandkids are learning. And this is why it matters that we have to be able, if we're going to change and restore culture, we have to know what truth is. And by the way, part of truth is we could not have become America without the contribution of the black patriots. And by the way, I can go down the list of the women involved. Like literally, we can go through, and one of the things that's crazy to me is I hate when we start breaking people up in people groups and we're saying, yeah, but we need an Irish American History Month, and we need these. Like, no. Here's the deal. James Armistead is not a great black hero. He's a great American hero. Yeah. Right? This is a totally different perspective than what we're doing today. And I'm saying that because it does say black patriots. I'm pointing that out because of the arguments today. Really what I would say is they're great American heroes nonetheless. With it being said, I could go through hundreds of historic black heroes who made incredible contributions. So this notion of the 1619 Project, that America's only ever oppressed and enslaved black people, or like critical race theory, right? This systemic racism and slavery and all these things, that's just simply not true at all if you know basic history. The problem is today, most people don't know basic history anymore. And with this being said, basically everything I've talked about tonight, we have documented in our book, The American Story. It has over 1,000 footnotes in it. And again, you shouldn't take my word on anything I've told you tonight. Not because it's not true, but because you have to own truth for yourself, right? We can't say, well, I heard this speaker one time say something. No. We need to know where to discover truth, right? I love my pastor. And if my pastor says, well, we know the Bible says this. Look, I love my pastor. I'm still looking up that verse in the Bible. I'm going to make sure it's what it actually says. We need to be pursuers of truth. And one of the things I can tell you where we are now, there's a lot of people who are frustrated. There's a lot of people who are overwhelmed or discouraged. I'm going to tell you, there's never been a better time to be in America because people have never been more hungry for truth, and it's never been more desperately needed than right now. And why that encourages me is because that means that people that have truth now have more power than they've ever had before because people are desperately looking for truth. We should be encouraged by the opportunity that's in front of us, recognizing that this is a great moment in our history that we can stand up and we can help be the turning tide that a generation from now people look back and go, man, wasn't that incredible when that happened? We can be those heroes, but we have to be people that know truth and have the courage to stand up and do what's right. See, if we walk in a room and the light's off, I would never panic that a room is dark. What do? Just flip on the light switch. All our culture needs is light. Jesus said, you are the light of the world. All our culture needs is us to know truth and have the courage to stand up and speak the truth. And I have great hope that we can turn this thing around. We just can't be discouraged and overcome with the challenges we see before us, right? If you remember from the Bible, when the Israelites were about to go take Canaan, and Moses said, let's choose a leader from every tribe and they can go and spy out the land, right? And they come back, and 10 of them are like, guys, right, they're coming back carrying this cluster of grapes, and it's huge, and like these incredible stories, but the giants are so big. You know, there's a reason we don't know the name of any of those 10 people. We know the names Joshua and Caleb. We don't know anybody else. The people that have the courage, that recognize there is a God, right? And if we're doing things for God, right, on behalf of the gospel, this is something significant. That we can say, Joshua and Caleb said, hey, there's huge giants. Let's go get them right now. Yeah. We don't need to be intimidated of what the enemy has to throw at us. We stand courageously in truth and we go forward to take back the promised land that God's given us. Amen? Amen. All right. I think we have a couple minutes for Q&A if we have any questions. I'm saying a couple minutes. I'm happy to stay here a lot of the night. Probably many of you would rather go home and go to bed. I support that decision too. But if we want to do a couple questions and answers, and I'm happy to stay and talk for a while if you need to think about it, or if you've heard me talk plenty enough, I have to, then we don't have to do any questions. But are there any questions? I'm going to give you an opportunity before we wrap things up. Yes, ma'am.
So if we go to WallBuilders.com, we can find this information and we can read and learn?
Yes, ma'am. So at WallBuilders.com, we write basically articles almost every week, and a lot of it's driven on some of the new nonsense that we hear. So we have multiple articles, for example, on like Columbus, or on slavery, or 1619 Project, critical race theory. So we will go back and try to show the true history of what happened. And again, we have it documented. At our organization, we have over 160,000 original artifacts, documents, etc. from American history. And so what we largely tell people is don't take our word for it. Here's the original document, like right, the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. So like just go read, and we'll try to give a link so people can see what it is and read it, and we'll highlight the sections. But yes, ma'am, on the WallBuilders website, we have a lot of stuff there. And then we have multiple resources, like out on the table. We have some resources. One of them is called Setting the Record Straight, American History in Black and White, where we actually go through many of these black heroes that are largely forgotten now. A lot of those are also in the book, The American Story. And so there's a few things that we have written, whether it's a DVD or MP3 or MP4 or a book, whatever's the most beneficial resource for you. There's a lot of things on the WallBuilders website. There's only a few I brought with me, a ton of stuff on the WallBuilders website. And we also have a daily radio program. We're all over social media. And so if you have kids and grandkids and you want them to hear some of this, just encourage them to check out our social media. There's another young man and I, he and I do a lot of videos. We tell a lot of these stories, but we try to do it in an engaging for young people way to try to help reach the next generation with some of this information. But the website, wallbuilders.com, a ton of stuff there, a ton of links other places as well. Yes, sir.
Is this recorded so we can get a copy of it?
I believe they're going to post it, right? It's Stand Up for Idaho.
Yes, it'll be up on our YouTube channel. You just go to YouTube and look for Stand Up for Idaho, and it'll be on YouTube. It takes me a couple of days to get it together. I'm not the most technically competent, but I'll have it up in a couple of days.
Thank you.
And we also have a YouTube channel, WallBuilders, so we'll have a lot of other stuff there as well. And before we get out of here, I would be very sad if I did not take the opportunity to recognize one of our good friends, I think a hero for your state, with Representative Earhart, who was here, who we do a lot of work with state legislators, and we are trying to fight to preserve a lot of basic constitutional, common sense, conservative, Christian values of the nation. And you have a representative here who is leading the charge on so many things. We are now seeing states around the nation who are doing bills to stand up for women's sports. Well, the very first one that was done in this state by that lady right there.
You guys were incredibly helpful in getting that started too. It wasn't just ADF, but let me also say, for the 4 years I've been a legislator, 3 of the 4 years I've been to their legislative WallBuilders. I only missed one because I had a knee replacement, so that's a pretty good reason. I also, maybe I might point out, I spoke to some of these people who were here the other day in a group setting. I shared with them, I also joined your, I realized when you get going, there's so much you don't know. You have concepts and principles, but I signed up for your Patriot Academy, and it's another way to really just sit and listen and learn from you and your dad and Carol Swain and so many people, and it's phenomenal. So
awesome.
We've got people waking up, and we appreciate that, guys.
Well, she's a genuine champion, and we are so proud of the work she is doing. And obviously in politics, people's personalities come out, and in politics you're highlighted, and so it's easy for people to nitpick and see flaws and imperfections and go, yeah, but she's a human. It's like, yes, my starting place was she was a human, right? So I'm not expecting anybody to be perfect. However, when you're looking for a courageous leader to stand up for basic values and principles, defending the Constitution, defending America, so proud of the work she's doing. So really grateful and appreciate you being here tonight too. All right, we can do one or two more questions and we'll try to wrap up so we can get out. Yes?
What do you see or foresee in the future for our younger generation? As you mentioned, they're canceling all these things out of the schools. What do you see coming in our future in our country?
So I'm actually, I think there's going to be some big challenges, but I'm encouraged on some levels too. So I'm encouraged by the basic fact that when we look back at COVID, obviously some terrible things happened in COVID, and many of us probably lost loved ones and just awful things. However, I can look at scripture and see that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love him, called according to his purpose. In Genesis, where Joseph told his brothers, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. I've seen God do some good from this COVID scenario, and one of the good things was when every parent was forced to homeschool their child, and parents for the first time were going, wait, what did that teacher just say? Parents have neglected some basic responsibilities in the educational system that, whether we're talking about American history or critical race theory or the sex ed curriculum, I mean, things that are graphic. Right now, Planned Parenthood is the #1 provider of sex ed curriculum in the nation. Okay, so like, if you're not familiar with Planned Parenthood, their business is killing babies, and so we can imagine what they're encouraging students. Nonetheless, parents are finding out about that. So where I'm encouraged is the more that parents find out, the more they get involved at the school board level, the city council level, the more we will see things turned around. And the reason I'm hopeful, and this is part one, the reason I'm hopeful, part one, is because it's easy to get overwhelmed looking at the nation, going, how can we, right, Schumer or Pelosi or Biden? It's easy to get overwhelmed the big picture, but the reality is, like, God hasn't called us to solve all the big picture problems. He's called us to be responsible with where he put us. And our responsibility is who's in our sphere of influence, right? So unless somebody in this room has Nancy Pelosi's cell phone, and if you do, please call her, let her know it's a problem. Our responsibility is what God's entrusted in front of us. And if everybody takes care of their area, right? If everybody tends their own garden, it's something we tell pastors. We do pastors conferences, and we'll tell pastors, it's not complicated. If every pastor said, we're going to take care of our community, if every pastor did that, all of a sudden every community is taken care of, and the nation almost overnight turned around. But it takes local people, and this is where pastors, it takes local people, local churches, people getting involved. And so I'm encouraged on some level because I do see that parents are getting involved like I've not seen literally maybe ever in the history of our nation with some of what we've done educationally. So that's number one. Number two, I do think it is very possible with some of the cases of the U.S. Supreme Court right now, that the Supreme Court will side on the states' rights position, where they say, like, whether it be the mandates or whatever else. I think there'll be several issues where they're going to kick it back and say, well, it's up to states to actually decide that. Here's where I think there's some good news and a lot of challenges ahead, is right now you have a lot of states who are doing some really dumb and bad things, right? Whether it be California or New York or Illinois, I mean really Illinois, Chicago and Governor Pritzker, but New Jersey, there's a lot of places doing some really dumb, bad things, but then there's states who are doing some really good things as well. And so what I think is if it goes back to states, and states really have a lot more power like they should, what we will see is some states will destroy themselves, and some states will do very, very well. So that's where I think there will be some challenges, because as states start to destroy themselves, that could look really messy for the nation as a whole. They're going to look for the federal government to solve their problems, which largely they've done with bailouts to this point. But I do think that's encouraging for a lot of us living in freedom states, and I think it's a great lesson opportunity for a lot of people in those states to go, you know what, San Francisco, I don't like having poop and needles all over the sidewalk, right? Having these homeless people arrest and steal and do like that. I'm not down for this. I think people will be confronted with the consequences of their actions. One of the things that's crazy about our nation is so many parents and the federal government is a big picture. They try to separate people from the consequences of their own actions. And because of that, right, I mean, as a country kid growing up, right, you don't get protected from most of the consequences of your actions, whether it's kicked by the horse or stepped on or thrown or whatever, right? Like, you just deal with consequences of your actions, right? Putting up a fence and you get cut, like, yeah, you just firsthand deal with it. But we see so much coddling and so much protection of people that they haven't had the opportunity to learn that lesson. And along those lines, if you read the parable of the Prodigal Son, we look and go, it's so great that he came back and he was openly received by the spiritual lesson we learned. Like, God will always take us back. It's great. Here's what's super fascinating to me. The part where he has this awakening, it says that he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that even the pigs were eating. It says, but no one gave him anything. Next verse. When he came to his senses, he said, even my father's servants, right, it's interesting that when you stop bailing people out, they have the opportunity to realize, hey, this isn't working. And I do think that's where, even though I think it could get really bad for some states, I think it could be a very good learning opportunity for them to go, this isn't working, I'm going to try something different. So I think there's a reason to be hopeful on the first front that parents are getting involved. That's really good. But I do think there could be some challenges in states before it all gets turned around, if that makes sense. We wandered for a minute. All right, one more question and then we'll wrap up. But I'm happy to stay and keep talking if y'all want to. Yes, ma'am.
The argument that I've heard the most from liberals as to why the Founding Fathers were racist was that they say that they considered them 1/5 of a person.
3/5.
3/5. But my understanding is that they did that so that the slave states who had that much population would have less voting power.
That's exactly correct. So the question was about the 3/5 compromise dealing with the Constitution. So one of the big arguments is the Founding Fathers, we know they were racist because the Constitution says black people are only 3/5 of a person. Have you read that clause? Because what it says is they only get 3/5 of the slave population represented in the portion for the assigning of congressmen. Well, counting only 3/5 of the people is not saying a person is only 3/5 of a person, right? That's totally different. It was absolutely during the debate over whether or not slavery or slaves should be included at all. And it's really worth going back and reading some of the records because there were many founding fathers. And this is where you see even early America, there was a big divide even then between philosophy from northern founding fathers and southern founding fathers. And one of the things to kind of supplement this, if you look at the signers of the Declaration, there were 56 guys that signed the Declaration. Today, people say all of them had slaves. All of them did not have slaves. It's argued approximately 41 of them had slaves. And that's approximate because for a few of them, there's not really good records. There's records that their family at one point had slaves, and then eventually they inherited their family farm. So for a few of them, like that, there's not really good records, but you kind of assume that they got the slave. Anyway, for most of those 41, we do know at some point they had slaves. What is largely left out of the discussion is how many of those 41 signers of the Declaration that had slaves actually freed those slaves in their lifetime, or started abolition societies, or volunteered and worked for abolition societies. And that's where, if you look at those 41, the vast majority of them actually ended up coming out against slavery. And there's some fascinating reads along the way, guys to study. John Jay was the original Supreme Court Chief Justice, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. He has several interesting letters. First one is 1776, where he says, and he's writing one of the other founding fathers, he says, it's occurred to me that it might be hypocritical for me as a slave owner to be fighting for my own freedom while I'm enslaving others. Now, we would look and go, well, of course it's hypocritical, you moron. Like, what's wrong with you? This is a world, not just America, the entire world had embraced the notion of slavery. So this was a big revelation for him. He has another letter, 1778, where he says, we have to end slavery because this is hypocritical and we can't do this anymore. At the end of the Revolution, he founds New York's Anti-Slavery or Abolition Society. John Jay is the founder of the Anti-Slavery Society of New York. Well, John Jay is in that group of individuals of founding fathers who at one point did have slaves and took a different position. Now, the reason I bring that up is because if you go to the Constitutional Convention, when they're debating over the 3/5 compromise, There were founding fathers who said there should be no slaves. In the southern, or we shouldn't count any slaves in the population for representation because you don't give them voting rights. And people who don't have voting rights shouldn't be counted in the population. Well, the guys in the South said, no, we should count them all. So there's really fun stuff from guys like Roger Sherman or James Wilson who get into these debates and they say, okay, well, if we're going to count our property, then I'm going to count my horses and my cows. I'm going to count my spoons and forks because they're my property and they have no more voting rights than your slaves do. I mean, like, some really interesting discussion. So they settled on, and there was a couple compromises offered, but they settled on a compromise of 3/5. But the 3/5 was to reduce the representation of the slaveholding population in Congress. Where you can see this really well illustrated is Frederick Douglass. When he was a slave, he escaped slavery, becomes an abolitionist, and works with another pastor who was a leader in the abolition movement. The pastor told them that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document because it's allowed slavery to exist. So Frederick Douglass actually, he wrote 3 different autobiographies. Nobody really knows how long they're going to live. So he wrote one when he was very young, and then lived a little longer, so he wrote a second one, then lived longer, so he wrote a third one. So there's 3 autobiographies. In his first autobiography, he writes that the Constitution is racist and it's terrible and America's bad. Then, if you read the second one, it's a little different. Because what happened is someone challenged him. Have you actually read the Constitution? He said, I haven't. They said, you should read the Constitution. In his second autobiography, he said, this is a glorious liberty document because nowhere in this document is slavery promoted, protected, or encouraged. In fact, if the idea was they wanted slaves to exist in America, surely they would have talked about slaves or slavery or the condition of the slave, and it's talked about nowhere. Instead, it's talked about equality for all men. That's the second one. His third autobiography happened at the end of the Civil War, and now he has seen where his idea was fully realized of freedom and emancipation, and he writes about how amazing America is and how only the Constitution allowed us to get to that place. So some people will look at Frederick Douglass and say, well, even Frederick Douglass talked about how racist the Constitution is. Okay, but when did he do that? Oh, you mean his first autobiography? Yes. You mean when he had never actually read the Constitution? Yes. He did say it was racist when he had never read it. And then he read it and had a different perspective. So that's some of the background behind it, but that is an argument people use as a 3/5 compromise. Actually, PragerU has a very good video that goes through this, and there's a lot of good people who have documented this and gone through it as well. But there are some fun debates from Congress where you do see what they're really debating out was the representation for congressmen, and the guys from the North were trying to reduce the representation the slaveholding states would have because they didn't want the power of the slaveholding states to increase to have more slaveholding states. And that's the history behind it. Guys, thank you so much for letting me share. Pastor, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Tim. That was awesome. I've got one announcement to make. We have found an envelope with the name Carrie on it. So if you lost that envelope, it is back at the table. And would you pray with me and we'll just get out of here. Father, thank you again for truth. And Lord Jesus, you tell us that you're the way, the truth, and the life. And so we just pray that as your people, we would stand for truth, no matter what that cost us, Lord. Lord, we have had so many go before us, Lord, who stood for the truth and actually gave their lives for the truth, Lord. So help us to be proclaimers of it, to love it, and to pursue it all of our days, Lord. Bless this group as they go out of these doors, Lord, that you would watch over them as they travel tonight. And Lord, may you just stir our hearts and draw us closer to yourself. In Jesus' name. And everybody said? Amen. Thank you.